Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Frank J. Ohlhorst, editor-at-large with Channel Futures. And my guest today is Reza Koranki. Did I get that right, Reza?
Good.
Wow, very good. He's with Arch Technologies. Today we're going to talk about OEM service level agreements, better known as SLAs, and sometimes referred to as service contracts, and the hidden problems with them, which surprisingly there are quite many hidden problems with these that I was even unaware of until I started researching, this a bit further and having some other conversations with Reza in the past. Reza, it's my understanding that OEM SLAs are seen as kind of a necessity for enterprises and service providers. However, it seems to me a lot of people fail to understand that there are significant downsides to those agreements. Can you fill us in on what some of those are?
Sure. Yeah, I would say that the downsides really, they organize themselves around one major thing, which is simply a lack of flexibility. That could be flexibility in pricing. It could be flexibility in the definitions of the service level agreement itself, what response times look like, what mean time to resolution looks like, if it's even there, and really what the commitment from the provider actually is. So an example of one is that a lot of people don't realize that service level agreements don't actually have a commitment to any kind of resolution.
Wow.
They have a commitment to a response time. And as long as the response time is being met, the contract and the obligations of the contract as a service provider are complete. So a lot of times people, it's like buying insurance and not knowing for sure that you would get your car repaired if you got in an accident. It's just knowing that the agent will call you back every time you call them. So that's a major one, and especially at the cost of how these agreements are, and as they increase through the life cycle of the equipment, really seems somewhat outrageous.
Wow, that I didn't know about. That there's, it seems to me like those OEMs, those people writing up these contracts, really have the full control over the situation, and users of the equipment are kind of trapped into that. So I'm pretty sure that when there's a failure on an SLA or the vendor doesn't come through, there must be a real significant impact on business. What are some of the hidden costs or liabilities that arise when those terms of the SLA aren't met?
Yeah, so there's a couple. There's really two things. One is what the outright cost is. It's really the cost of downtime. So if you look in the U.S., the average, according to ZDNet, the average cost of downtime in the U.S. from small business to the largest is about $40,000 per hour. So as a general rule of thumb, you can assign $40,000 an hour to any real downtime situation. Again, that's downtime period. It's not the severity of any specific downtime, just the downtime costs in the U.S. So that alone is significant. It's also the opportunity cost of what the staff could be doing if they were not having to deal with a down situation with a relatively slow response. They're actually getting slower and slower, and the mean time to resolution from OEMs is getting longer and longer. Part of that technology is getting more advanced, and it's more complex. And the other part of it is due to outsourcing, and the vendors are the cheapest available vendor to the OEM that they can outsource to for lower tiers of support results in a lower quality of service. So the biggest thing is downtime. And then secondarily, the opportunity cost of what are generally shrinking IT departments and them spending more and more time on cases than working on new deployments of technology or increasing performance versus what they're doing with service agreements to just get it back up and running. So those are the biggest two. Also, as the contracts go up, those costs are just compounded on top. The largest cost, quite honestly, isn't the service agreement. There's the price, and then there's the cost. And a lot of times the price is high, the cost is high, and it's gotten worse and worse, at least over the last 7 or 8 years. So pretty significant on what I would say the indirect costs are.
Wow. So, so every minute a technician waits on hold for their service people under these contracts to get back to them can have a significant cost. And I gather not only, the cost of that technician wasting their time, but also the downtime that might be associated with it and the potential for lost business. Let's say it's an e-commerce site or something like that. It can really escalate, and these contracts wind up costing a lot more than they might be worth in those situations, I would guess.
Yeah,
So, I mean,
consider what happened with the airlines. I think it was a couple of years ago where however many flights were grounded because of some, IT network related issue. I mean, there's a real cost to the business, not just in their performance and their uptime, the continuity of the infrastructure, but also in that case, delivering services and letting planes take off. So it can be significant. And also having the engineers go through the same steps that they've gone through, that they know to go through.
Yeah.
They're asked to do it again as part of these service agreements to keep the outsourced vendor that the OEM is using to keep it in their silo.
Yeah, the good old, oh, did you turn it on and off again,
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, those are some pretty significant issues that I think most folks, especially those that are, writing the checks and whatnot, are outside of their purview. I mean, what can they do to mitigate these issues?
So there's a couple of things, right? I mean, so there's a level of flexibility that you can have within your channel partner. So if you're buying OEM level services, you have some control with your channel partner. They can actually help and augment and fill some gaps that the OEMs typically won't. They're very strict on, this is the SLA, this is the price, this is what we'll do. The channel partners are, if you've got a good one, they're good at filling in some of the gaps. They'll say, okay, well, let's say you run into something that's uncovered, that you meant to cover that just got missed, or even worse, the channel partner missed or the OEM missed. They can help to fill those gaps and to push those tickets through and to get them going, where otherwise you would just be stuck saying, hey, that's not under support, call us whenever you buy it. That doesn't work in a down scenario. So leveraging your channel partner, your sales guy, the typical approach that you would, it's like if you bought a car, you call your sales guy, you have a problem first. And if your sales guy can't handle it, then you can call the warranty department. So that's one way to kind of circumvent the inefficiencies they have. The other is to really consider just different approaches. A lot of people don't. They think that the OEM is the only option, and in some cases it really is. There are certain things that should only be covered by them, but there's other options for support, outside the OEM in a lot of cases.
Very good. And I gather there's another issue there is like you just say, leveraging your channel partner or your sales person or whatever to try and get that extra support. But I mean, as you know, most, large enterprises or data centers and all that don't deal with a single vendor. You might have 5 different vendors in this. So does that mean when you have a problem, use with this OEM type support that you might have to call 5 different vendors to try and figure out what the problem is?
Oh, for sure. And there's a likelihood that you'll be calling them more than once. It's similar to the AC guy blaming the plumber. You've really got to get them in the house at the exact same time to be able to figure out which one is really at fault. Otherwise, you run the risk of having them out multiple times and diagnosing different things, and in some cases making it worse, where if they're uneducated on what it could be, and they just either think it's on their box, they think it isn't, they'll suggest changes outside of really their purview, and that can create a lot of issues. So the key is to get them all on the phone at the same time, and it's really difficult from an OEM SLA perspective. They really avoid it, and you've really got to be Verizon or AT&T to really get that to happen.
Interesting. So how do we solve all these problems? I'm sure that, Arch comes to the table with some ideas on how to resolve these problems. And so how do we solve these problems? And, what does Arch do? And where can we get some additional information?
Yeah, so great. So there's 2 distinct domains in which you would look to go solve it. The first one is to handle what I would say the inefficiencies in the agreements as they stand. So what we've seen statistically and what we do, so there's 2 elements to what Arch does, and I'll go into that in a little bit, but on an overarching perspective, it's assessments and then service agreements. So what we would have someone go look at is look at your service agreement, and we found that 80% of all service agreements have at least an 11 to a 15% inefficiency in costing due to the client not leveraging all that's available to them, not just in the service agreement, but also as being the client and being a rightful owner of certain pieces of equipment. So we found in service agreements that about 8% of any given service agreement, clients are paying for service that they don't necessarily have to. They're entitled to the service through some other means, entitled to it under some kind of entitled service through some other license agreement that's in place, excuse me, and really figuring out those efficiencies and reducing costs from that perspective. The other side is to really work to craft the SLAs, and this is the part that can get sticky. It's contract negotiations with a behemoth of an OEM that are very strict on what they do. So the best layer to do that within your current agreements are to do that with your channel partner, to have them assist in some kind of NOC or SOC capacity where they are, maybe your first line of support, and they're resolving all of the RMA issues and the entitlement issues, and making sure that if you've got a problem from a basis level that the part's failed or you need basic troubleshooting, that they can handle that without you running into the entitlement issue that you would get from the OEM if it possibly wasn't handled. They've simply got better ways to do that as a client. It's still pretty limited. You can, we know that we can save at a minimum 11% on, almost all service agreements through investment without changing the SLA, without changing the vendor, without changing the discount. It's just education and the application of that education. The second part is the service agreement part. So this has to be done with a high level of intention and a lot of education. It's very dangerous to go and say, okay, well, this agreement's inefficient. We're spending too much time on the phone. It costs us too much money. So let's look at an independent or a third-party provider and to go give them the whole bucket and say, hey, do everything. The risk that you run is that the level of support is reduced and there's commitments of what can be delivered far beyond what independents and third parties should do. So you want to take an educated approach at what should a third party cover, what should they absolutely not cover, and then what could really be up between a third party and an OEM, and know the gotchas. So there's these three distinct buckets. So what Arch does as a service provider is we take an educated approach on a client's install base and say, hey, listen, this third you should absolutely cover with the OEM. It could be applications, intrusion prevention, subscriptions, anything really heavily IP related that really is best served by the OEM. There's always going to be, let's say, 20 to 30%. The remaining 70%, 80% can be covered by an independent or a third party that's technical and has the resources in place, both physically, logistically, and more importantly, TAC, to respond, troubleshoot, and resolve issues with metrics built into the contracts that force them to do that or require that they do that, with the bandwidth to improve the quality of service, not just to reduce the cost. We talked earlier, again, there's two things, the price and the cost. If we reduce the price, but the cost is way higher, it doesn't serve anybody. You've really got to work on reducing both. So what we do is we take an educated look. We say, this is what the OEM should do. This is what a third party should absolutely do. We look at that from milestone perspectives, from entitled services that say 30% of a given install base, 30 to 40% actually has access to free software outside of service contracts. And that's usually the biggest hangout for a client is, well, they want to have access to software. They don't know that so much of it actually is free based on them being the licensed owner. We'll provide the OEM documentation to back that up and say that 40% absolutely cover with a third party, qualify the third party, make sure they have the right engineers, the right capabilities, bandwidth, everything like that. And then there's probably a remaining 20% that could be a jump ball, and there's always going to be some gotchas. So know what the gotchas are, know if they're worth, again, know if the price is worth the cost, and then make an educated decision and make sure that those buckets are separated in a way that you can decide without saying no to one piece and then skyrocketing the price on the other piece. So that's what Arch does. We do it across the globe. We've got 4 technical assistance centers and 300 engineers that do that with 400 depots. So very capable on that side of it. And that's the approach that we would take versus a very low-tech break fix in the market, which is pretty common. What is out there a lot is what I would say they'll find out it's broken. And if it's broken, you'll get a new piece. And if it's not broken, then you're just kind of stuck on the phone trying to figure it out. Our focus is the opposite. It's on TAC with obviously logistics, infrastructure support, broken equipment, and RMAs and SLAs.
All right, very good. I understand that you have some additional collateral available to our viewers out there. I know that you're looking to, help enterprises by performing some free assessments.
Yeah.
And I believe you have a series of webinars coming up. Would you mind if I included links to that information in the text around this interview?
That'd be great. Yeah, we've got some collateral around free assessments. What that'll do is a little bit about it'll help identify those buckets, and also what I talked about earlier as far as, how do we lower costs without reducing SLA, the discount, or the provider? Just truing up the agreements in that way, and those assessments they'll point you in the right direction. They'll show you where the efficiencies are and where the cost savings can be had. And then the webinar is a much more in-depth approach. It's the really the nuts and bolts of that, and also what SLAs mean, what they are, and the impact that they have on the business.
All right, very good. Maybe I'll join you for those webinars. All right, I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Lots of good information there. I think things that our audience should be really aware of, especially when it comes to these escalating costs and how negatively that can impact running a business. Very interesting material. Once again, thank you, Reza.
Yeah, thank you, Frank.